Good evening, everyone. I'm Nancy Norwood. I'm the Curator for European Art here at MAG, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this lecture, which is in conjunction with our exhibition Under the Microscope, Rembrandt's Young Man in an Armchair, which is in the Lockhart Gallery down the hall. So just a few words about our speaker. The exhibition Under the Microscope could not have happened without Fiona Beckett, who spearheaded the analysis of our very problematic painting by Rembrandt. And it's really been quite the journey. I was looking back, and it was 2019 that the painting and I went to Buffalo for a week. And there, Fiona Beckett and her colleagues at the Garman Art Institute, or Art Conservation Department, performed every possible scientific and imaging analysis that I've ever heard of, and some I'd never heard of, on our painting. And the results have just as the tip of the iceberg that you see in the exhibition, and that's the topic that Fiona will speak about tonight. So in terms of her bio, she's the Associate Professor of Painting Conservation at the Garman Art Conservation Department at the State University of New York, Buffalo State University. She holds a master's degree in art conservation with a specialization in paintings from Queen's University in Kingston, Canada, and a BFA honors from the University of Ottawa. Fiona has also held positions at the Indianapolis Museum of Art as the closed conservator of paintings and the National Gallery of Canada as the Director's Fellow in Conservation. She's also a professional associate and editor of the painting specialty group Postprints of the American Institute for Conservation. I also would like to take this opportunity to thank the sponsors of the exhibition, gifts from the MAG Council, the Lewis Norrie family, a gift in memory of George D. and Frida B. Abraham from Dr. David Z. Friedberg, and Barbara and George Siegel allowed us to create the ambitious interactive that includes interviews with Fiona that you'll find in the exhibition itself, and it showcases the work that was done at the Garman Art Conservation Department on behalf of MAG's painting. It was a delight for me to work with Fiona on the exhibition, and I know you'll enjoy hearing her speak to what she discovered about our painting and the processes available to conservators in our times. Please join me in welcoming Fiona Beckett, who will speak on Rembrandt Beneath the Surface, a closer look at Portrait of a Young Man in an Armchair. Thank you.
Okay, hello and good evening. And before we get started, thank you so much, Nancy, for the introduction. And I'll just say that we did not do every single possible analysis, but we did quite a bit, so I'm excited to share it with you. So this evening, I'm pleased to share with you the technical analysis of a painting that's on exhibition here at the Lockhart Gallery, entitled Portrait of a Young Man in an Armchair. So the analysis was completed at the Garman Art Conservation Department in Buffalo. And I do think it's part of what could be considered ongoing research, as I do think you can always learn more. But I will present the findings that we have so far, and this is definitely a collaborative effort, so I'd just like to point out a few other people that have worked on this, including Professor Juan Chen, Dr. Rebecca Ploger, and Dr. Aaron Sugar. The title of the exhibition is Rembrandt Under the Microscope, and the title of this talk is Rembrandt Beneath the Surface. And one of the interesting things about this painting is that it contains some mysteries about its past, surrounding the attribution, and as we shall see, this is part of the reason for the current study. This research started back in 2019, as Nancy mentioned, when the Garman Art Conservation Department was fortunate to collaborate with the Memorial Art Gallery. And I should note that they've collaborated before and we're continuing to collaborate. We were able to connect with Dr. Nancy Norwood, and we were thrilled to use our instrumentation and imaging equipment to conduct technical analysis of Portrait of a Young Man in an Armchair, seen here on the left. On the right, you can see the building where the conservation labs are held. And in the middle, you can see the paintings labs with some painting students conducting treatments. And it's important to note that this painting did undergo technical analysis, but did not undergo treatment at that time. So we coordinated with Nancy, and we were able to bring the painting temporarily to Buffalo and make use of the analytical instrumentation and imaging on site, which is much easier than trying to do this in situ. We were also able to involve some of our painting students who were very thrilled to be part of this process. The goal was to research the painting and use current knowledge and equipment in the field to compare the results to what we know about Rembrandt's materials and techniques. First, a bit of background. The painting is part of the George Eastman collection here at the Memorial Art Gallery, and it was acquired in 1969. Eastman bought it from the famous Knoedler Galleries in New York in 1911, which famously closed in 2011. Before that, it was in London belonging to a C.J. Wertheimer in 1895, and prior to that, and the first record is belonging to Lord Carrington between 1836 and 1895. The painting is not signed nor dated, though the painting's date is indicated as 1660 and would qualify as a later work of Rembrandt, and he died in 1669. In all, this leaves about 176 years unaccounted for in terms of provenance. This is important because the painting has seen a little bit of back and forth. Is it Rembrandt? Is it not Rembrandt? Many paintings do have a gap in their provenance because even though record keeping was certainly done, often we can't find the records today. There has been a significant amount of research on Rembrandt that has already been done. The Rembrandt Research Project is a major initiative of the Netherlands Organization for Scientific Research, and its purpose is to organize and categorize research on Rembrandt with the aim of discovering new facts about him and his studio. It started in 1968 and has since become the authority on Rembrandt and has had the final say in many paintings and whether they're genuine. Although this is not necessarily accepted by everyone, and paintings have actually changed their attributions since then. It gives precisely 324 surviving pictures to Rembrandt's own hand. Prior to that, there has been as many as 600 or as few as 200. I should note that the Memorial Art Gallery painting is not included in this research as a Rembrandt, though it has been treated as such in several catalog raisonnés before this. There has been much more recent research on specific paintings, such as Rembrandt's Night Watch, coined Operation Night Watch, which looks at everything with imaging, sampling, pigments, layer structure, and I'll just mention they have a fantastic website if you're interested. And the point is that there is a lot of information with which we can compare. And if we can get information from our painting, we can compare what's been recently discovered and been documented over the years. As a result of all of this, we know Rembrandt's palette is very well known and has been extensively studied. We know what materials he used, his colors, his general style, and on the right you can see a list of some of the pigments that he used, including the most common, highlighted in orange. And I will revisit this list later to compare it to the Memorial Art Gallery painting. So some of the pigments, as you can see on the slide, are azurite, smalt, lead tin yellow, and they've got their color beside them. Yellow ochre, red ochre, orpiment, vermilion, madder, cochineal, raw sienna, raw umber, burnt umber, castle earth, brown ochre, lead white, bone black, sometimes charcoal black, and a few others that didn't quite make it to this list. Along with the palette and its pigments, we can also get an understanding of the layer structure that has already been established. So in established research, we find that a lot of Rembrandt's grounds, or the first priming layer that was applied to the painting, was studied. A ground is the first layer of paint-like materials on the canvas. So typically you'll have the canvas, which you see here, and then usually there's like a glue layer, sometimes a lead layer, that is present over top of the canvas. And above this is what is considered the ground, and this can be 1 or 2 layers. And these layers can impact how we see the painting. So if you have a colored layer or a colored ground, it impacts the entire painting. Rembrandt's grounds have been extensively studied, and a lot of images have been taken of cross-sections of areas of paintings, and you can see some of these here on the right. These are detailed in a Corpus of Rembrandt Paintings publication. And quite a few of them actually exhibited 2 layers. So if you look at the first set of images on the left where it says double ground, you can see the first layer at the bottom is kind of a reddish color, and then above that is a white color. So that's been found on numerous paintings and has been well documented. And this is not the only type of ground. There are a number of different other colored grounds as well. On the right, you can see what's called a quartz ground. Quartz grounds are a mixture of colorless sand, earth, clay, and a binder, and sometimes with some pigment particles as well. And some of the grounds that were quartz-based also had about 60% quartz in the ground layer. And this is where it becomes really interesting, because quartz grounds from this time are actually unique to Rembrandt and his studio, and this has been known for some time. In fact, studies have looked at other paintings with no connection to Rembrandt during the same time, and not one of these had a quartz ground. There are also no written sources or Dutch recipes of such grounds until after Rembrandt's death. And that means that every painting with a quartz ground from this time, between 1640 until Rembrandt's death in 1669, is prepared in Rembrandt's studio and is a direct link to Rembrandt. Quartz ground was also found on the night watch, which you can see here, done in 1642. And here is a sample from that with the quartz ground, which is the brown portion at the bottom. So I'd like to pause and address why Rembrandt would have used this type of preparation or ground layer. Rembrandt was a member of the St. Luke's Guild of Amsterdam starting in 1634, and you can see his funerary medallion here. The guild included local potters, painters, and other artisans, and regulated the profession. Being part of the guild gave him access to different materials, including earthen materials such as clay or quartz, and these would have been readily available to him. A quartz-clay mixture already is a little bit brown in color, which fits nicely with his painting style. And you can see two of the paintings here that have quartz grounds are actually also brownish in color. And so he might have preferred a toned priming layer in this case. It also saved him the trouble from going over something that was white with a subsequent brown layer. And to that effect would also be cost-effective. Knowledge is continually building, and most recently in the night watch, which I showed you on the previous slide, they have also found since a very, very thin layer of lead just underneath the quartz ground, and used to press into the canvas structure, which is very interesting. And so, nevertheless, this quartz ground gave us an avenue to explore with the Memorial Art Gallery painting. So in addition to the research that is on quartz ground that we know of, there has also been other research regarding Rembrandt's impasto. And here you can see a detail of the impasto on the left. Impasto is like a textured surface of the paint that physically sticks out of the painting. And you can see kind of here where the brushstroke just ends, and he's lifted his brush off of the canvas with this relief of white paint. And you can almost see where it's just barely blended into the red. So a 2019 study found in this layer a rare mineral called plumenacrite. And this was only found in the impasto layer and was identified in 4 Rembrandt paintings. It's not yet specific to Rembrandt because much more study needs to be done, so it's possible that it's in other paintings as well. The compound itself is quite unusual and only stable at high pH. In other words, it's rare. It's thought that Rembrandt also added a compound to form this called litharge, a lead-based pigment, often used for ceramics or glazes in manuscripts. It's not great as a pigment on its own, but it's thought that he would add this to his paints and thus leading to the formation of plumenacrite to allow the paint to maintain that texture because it would form a thicker paint, and the extra lead from the litharge would cause the paint to dry more quickly. The finding is also a little bit surprising since that compound, plumenacrite, is generally found in 20th century works onward. This finding coincided with the timing of our study, and so we thought, why not? We were curious, and could we identify it in this painting as well? And so with the latest knowledge in the field being published, we got the wonderful opportunity to look at the painting in the department. The goal is to compare the painting with recent research, but not necessarily determine any attribution. With that in mind, we tailored our analysis to find the most useful information, evidence of the artist's working method, palette, colors, what type of ground, and to test for quartz, and also looking at the impasto for that plumenacrite compound. Also, we wanted to better understand its past, the damages over time, and look at the previous conservation attempts. Because all of these things can really impact how we interpret a painting based on what we can or can't see, and is sometimes overlooked or not fully understood. So on the left, you can see a list of techniques that we used, and we'll go through a few of these in further detail. And what you saw on the right was a time lapse of one component of the imaging process, which was the infrared imaging, in which we had to take sections of the painting, image it, and then reassemble all of it to make a full image in Photoshop. Okay, so one of the first steps in looking at a painting is often imaging. It's a nice, easy way to document the painting, and you can glean a lot of information. And it's also non-destructive. Extensive imaging was done in the department, and we only had a few days with the painting, so everything had to be really well planned. We will look at some of these images in more detail, and I'll highlight what we found. But here you can see we did an X-ray. We looked at it with UV, normal images, which you can get quite a few details if you go in very close, false color, and reflected infrared. In looking at the X-ray image, it allows us to look through the painting and see the different radio opacities of the paint. So for example, denser elements like lead or mercury will appear white, versus more organic materials which will appear black in the image. We can see a few things. We can see the stretcher, which is that wooden frame around the back of the painting in the X-ray image, and we can also see some of the metal hardware, which is appearing white. In the detail on the right, you can see that there's actually a change made to the composition, and this shows up really nicely in the X-ray. And so the hands were initially positioned higher up, and then moved shortly after lower down in the composition. The different densities that we can see here are also useful to compare when we do other types of analysis as well. Next, looking at the painting with UV. So here we can see some images that were generated when we imaged the painting, capturing the fluorescence with the camera. And we can see a general greenish hue over the entire surface of the painting. The greenish color is indicative of a natural resin varnish that was applied to the surface and has aged over time. And this is what it looks like under UV and obscures part of the composition. In the detail on the right, you can see that greenish fluorescence, but you can see some small little brush strokes around the face and the hat. And these little brush strokes are actually later restoration additions, so painting that has been added to cover up damages and are not original to the painting. This is another powerful technique that gives lots of information about the painting, especially the surface components. And reflected infrared imaging. This type of imaging usually provides a lot of information that is below the upper layers of the painting, so usually it'll tell us a little bit more about the composition planning or things that are hidden that are not quite in the upper layers because we're looking a little bit deeper than those upper layers. However, with this one, we did not see too many things that were indicating any kind of composition planning or underdrawing. We get a slight glimpse of reworking, perhaps around the hands where there's some slight modifications that were made, but not nearly as much as with the X-ray. However, this would also have been in line with Rembrandt's working technique, and he did not necessarily sketch everything out. Alongside the analysis, I took time to look at the historical records on file. You might ask, how important are previous treatments? Well, very important. In fact, a whole conference was dedicated to previous treatments of Rembrandt paintings alone, and this was hosted at the Rijksmuseum in November of 2018. Treatments in the past by previous restorers were often harsher than today's methods, more frequent, and so we garner information about what we are seeing. Additionally, there are some trends in treatments based on renowned restorers, specific varnishes or materials, and certain ways of doing treatments that have since changed in the field. What we are seeing may not just be the paint in the way that Rembrandt or Studio of Rembrandt or any other artist painted it, but may be considerably influenced by both the damages and the treatments that have happened to the painting since. This painting has a long history, much of which remains to be discovered. However, we do have some records that we can use to better understand it. On August 8th, 1930, there was a letter to George Eastman from Wilhelm R. Valentiner, a German art historian, advisor to and then director of the Detroit Museum of Art, which is now the DIA. He wrote his dissertation on Rembrandt and had several other Rembrandt studies. In the letter, he writes, quote, "In the former catalogs, I find that it was fully signed and dated 1660. But now neither the signature nor the date is anywhere visible. Also, the figure was much clearer in the outline in some of the reproductions in former publications." unquote. This was very interesting for me to read. I am not a curator, but I did try to look for some additional evidence, specifically the signature and the date, and I revisited the infrared image to try and scour it for any indication of such. And I couldn't find any images, and I couldn't find any references to it. Nevertheless, I was still intrigued, but I couldn't explain why there was this quote, and then, perhaps he was confusing it with another painting, or this was a mistake. George Eastman must have been inspired to find the signature as well, because also in August of 1930, the painting was sent to Thomas Agnew and Sons, restorers in London. Eastman wanted the painting to be cleaned, quote, right down. I'm happy to say what the restorer's response was. Quote, I am sure you will appreciate that with such important pictures as your Rembrandt, one avoids cleaning the picture right down. The painting then passed through 4 more restorers in the 20th century. The second conservation attempt was possibly Stephen Picato. We have a quote, but no report. In the quote, he mentions his proposed treatment, which includes removing the varnish, removing the overpaint, which would have been restorer's paint, relining, which means adding a canvas to the back, a new canvas to the back of the original canvas, often with the use of glue, a new stretcher, in-painting, and varnishing. In-painting is often done to cover up damages. And it's important to note that even when in-painting and varnishing were done, these were, even at this time, designed to be more easily removed than the original paint layer of the painting, so as to not affect the original paint layer. Third to treat this painting is William Sirr in 1936. As a prolific restorer, he kept meticulous notes. His treatments that he performed included cleaning, tear repair, in-painting, and varnishing. He also recommended that the painting be treated with something called copaiba balsam, later done at the museum. This is interesting because copaiba balsam is also known as a very specific historical technique and has been used on a lot of Rembrandt paintings. It has also been known to soften and swell the painting and the varnishes and create sometimes unpredictable effects in later treatments. And it also has the possibility of dissolving paint into neighboring paint at the microscopic level, so you might see an extra blending of paint that you might not otherwise have seen. Next was New York City art dealer and restorer Cesar Diorio. He was hired by Eastman House for conservation work from time to time, and the treatment included cleaning, removing that glue lining from the back of the painting, and then a double wax lining with a lead primed linen. So 2 more canvases added to the back of the painting, one of which had linen, both of which had, or lead, and both of which had wax. In painting with damar and dry pigments, varnishing, and then a wax coating. Next, the painting was treated at the Intermuseum Conservation Association, also known as ICA, in Oberlin, and this was done in 1969 by Richard Buck and Delbert Spurlock. This was done actually after the recovery of the theft of 1968, in which the painting disappeared for 9 months and was later recovered. The treatments performed here including remove the glue and the second relining canvas, wax resin lining onto a 3rd canvas. So one of the canvases was removed and then another canvas was added. Stretched onto a new stretcher, which is that wooden support you can see in the upper right. Inserts were added, so that's typically done in areas where there's damage of the canvas. Adding an insert would add an insert of canvas to try and fix that area. In-painted and varnished with a synthetic varnish called B72. So this is what we have now with the canvases, one with lead, one with just wax, the new stretcher, the painting, and then varnish over the surface. So the number of treatments that have happened since, and this is just in the 20th century, are listed here on the right. So there are a number of undocumented treatments that would have certainly happened before this, but you can see that there is a number of varnish removals, varnish applications, removing an addition of linen supports that were glued to the back, and the painting over of previously damaged areas. And the final result is now 3 canvases thick, including the original support, with 2 added lining canvases, one with wax and one with lead. But after all of these treatments, I was only able to find a couple images from the 1969 treatment. This is typical, as documentation and imaging wasn't as developed or practiced as it is today. So here are a couple images taken during the cleaning, and you can begin to understand why all of the treatments that happened were important, and also the amount of damage that had occurred to the painting in the first place. I'm not sure the reason for the damage. The painting is very old, and so it's possible that there were some tears or punctures, water damage, abrasions that contributed to the lost paint. I also wanted to mention that the painting was sent to Harvard Art Museums at their Center for Technical Studies in 1991 for analysis. This was also done to compare the painting to materials known to be used by Rembrandt with the research available at the time. And the result was, yes, everything would fit with what Rembrandt used, but also with other artists. And so since then, there has been new research and new technology, and so we really wanted to revisit the technical analysis and build on it with additional imaging, which I've shown you, updated analytical techniques, and look specifically for quartz in the ground layer. So in addition to the imaging, one of the things we're able to perform is called X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy in the form of XRF mapping. So this is using the technique of X-ray fluorescence and was performed on the painting in the areas of the hands and the face, and you can see the area that was scanned here, outlined in red. What this allowed us to do is provide a map of the composition, but for each element. So it generates these maps. A scan takes a considerable amount of time. I believe this one took between 4 to 6 hours to complete. And so what this gives you is several different maps. So for example, in the center, we have the map of everywhere that iron is found on this painting. In the middle, we have the lead map, so everywhere that lead is found, and the calcium map at the far end. And since we know what elements pigments contain as well and what colors they are, we can put all of this information together and figure out what is actually used or what is present on the painting and get a better sense of what these materials are. This can also identify areas of modern repair and changes to the composition that, along with other imaging techniques, can better illuminate these changes. So we'll go into some of these maps in greater detail and talk about the pigments that they indicate. So here's again the scan of the lead map. And it's not surprising that there's lead everywhere because there was that lead lining that was added to the painting. So it is expected that there's lead present throughout this entire painting. But here you can also see that it is related in part to the composition. So in the areas of the face and the hands, these appear brighter white. And this corresponds to lead white as a pigment, which you can see on the right. Lead white is a very historically important and valued pigment. And many pigments have an odd way of being made. In the 17th century, lead white was made by taking metallic lead and wrapping it into a coil shape, which you can see here, and then placed into a container of vinegar, and several of these would be made at the same time. And then stacking these containers in a shed of sorts, and these would then be surrounded by horse manure, which produced heat, and which in turn corroded the lead alongside the vinegar, and this formed something called lead carbonate. And that is the wonderful lead pigment that was widely used and creates these creamy, thick brush strokes that you can see in detail in some of the images. On the left, you can see the women that were helping to help create this pigment, stacking some of these coiled lead in pots. I also mentioned iron, and so here again we have the iron map, and you can see where the earth pigments would have been used. Earth pigments have iron in them, and so we know that in relation to what we're seeing on the map and the presence of the iron in the various earth pigments, that this is something that would have been part of the palette and was absolutely used. And some of this also coincided with manganese, so that specifically indicates umber, one of the earth pigments as well. So these are nice, stable, non-toxic pigments, would have been used by many, many artists, and ranging as far back to cave paintings when we were first learning how to paint. Another element that we found was cobalt, and at first this was perplexing because cobalt is typically related to a blue pigment. And we look at the painting and there's no blue on the painting, or at least very little, pretty much none. Cobalt, along with the presence of other elements, including impurities such as iron or nickel, suggests smalt blue. And this is a pigment that was part of Rembrandt's and a 17th century palette. But again, there's no blue in the painting. So first, let's look at how cobalt blue is, or how smalt blue is made. It's made by mixing cobalt oxide with silica or sand, and you can see that here on the left, and potassium carbonate, and heating it, and after that, it turns blue. The shock from the temperature change as it comes out of the oven causes it to shatter into pieces, and it's like a glass-like material that's then mixed as a pigment. If you grind it too much, it doesn't quite work because all of the color, because of the glass-like consistency, will disappear. So it was actually used in a more coarser form. It was also used in the famous Delftware that we can see that is famous in Holland, and so you can see an example of that on the right. It also doesn't keep its blue color. And research shows that Rembrandt actually didn't even use it for its blue color. He used it to mix with other pigments, including earths and blacks, and his intention was actually not to create a blue paint. Instead, he was exploiting the properties of cobalt as a dryer that was present in that pigment. The cobalt itself causes the oil to dry more rapidly, and in fact, you can purchase cobalt dryer in the store today, and that will speed up the drying process of your painting. The smalt itself also degrades, turning brown over time. So it's likely that he knew this and was exploiting this, and in fact, a lot of Rembrandt's late paintings show an abundant use of smalt. So this fits in with what we're seeing visually, but also with the XRF analysis in terms of that map. Mercury was found in the painting, and we can see the map here of where mercury is. And this relates to a vibrant red pigment made out of mercuric sulfide called vermilion, which you can see on the right. And it is a very bright orange and very opaque pigment that is also very toxic. And in fact, there is a bright spot on the map just by the eye, if you can see his proper left eye, that shows a very dense area. Because it's so bright white on the map, we know that there's a lot of mercury in that area. And when we look at the image up close, we have this perfect dab of vermilion that's placed just there that corresponds with that spot. The presence of both calcium and phosphorus, as you can see the maps on the bottom, indicates bone black. Bone black is a carbon pigment that is made from charring animal bones. It's actually the least pure carbon black and could be made from a mixture of a number of different bones, simply discarded, but also including perhaps ivory. It's a very fine black and has been described as having some bluish tones, but also sometimes brownish tones as well. Bone black was used extensively in this portrait and is a well-known pigment in many palettes of the time, and also widely used in many of Rembrandt's paintings. And it seems his favorite black is bone black. Alongside the artist materials, I mentioned earlier that you can also identify conservation materials or more modern pigments. And so we found several areas and several elements that suggest modern pigments, which is not surprising because even in the UV image, you could see those brush strokes of the 20th century restorations. And so on the left map, we have a titanium map, which would indicate titanium white, which is a 20th century pigment. And it coincides perfectly with an area of damage. The chromium map indicates a chromate pigment or chromium-based pigment that are typical from the 19th century and also seems to be related to overpaint at that time. So these are not original to the piece. I will admit that they could also be studied further. We also used another technique that measures the spectral curve of light called fiber optics reflectance spectroscopy, or FORS. And we did this around a transparent area, or a transparent red area around the areas of the mouth and the eyes, typically where you would find a red lake pigment. And so we were looking for this. And this is used to kind of apply a transparent wash to already red areas and highlight these features. While more study would have to be done, the initial results suggest that it is likely cochineal, an important red dye made from the female cochineal insect. Here you can see the insects in the picture on the right, and the beautiful red color on the left. This colorant has a long history and was imported to Europe from Central and South America as early as 1540, where it quickly replaced the local sources as the primary red dyestuff. The insects feed on cacti and are collected from the cacti and then dried and crushed prior to being used. This is also, it's not a pigment, it's actually a dye, so it has to be further processed and affixed to a substance before then turning into this powder, which you can see here on the left. It's also known as Red 40, which can be found still in food and cosmetics today. And I'll just mention that it is not light fast and does fade over time. So in instances where it's been used and aged or exposed to light, there is a good chance that it has faded. And so many portraits that we're seeing that maybe would have had more red in the features of the face, for example, appear whiter over time. So we were able to do some additional analysis and got permission to take some microscopic samples. And this was done in areas of existing damage. So the process is to take a minuscule sample and embed it in resin, and then you can see the sampling process here on the left and the location of the samples on the right. We were able to do X-ray diffraction with Dr. Jason Benedict and student Shay Myers at the University of Buffalo. So this is a technique that can analyze the physical properties and the composition and the crystal structure. It's useful for minerals. And if you recall the plumanacrite that we were trying to find, this was the technique that we used to see if we could find it. And so we worked with the University at Buffalo to do this. The results indicated that the samples likely contain a mixture of cerussite and hydrocerussite, and this is related to the lead white pigment that I was telling you earlier. So in essence, just lead white. We didn't find anything specifically related to plumanacrite in the sample, though they were clear to say that it doesn't mean it's not there, and it's possible that it just wasn't in this particular sample. I will say also that we didn't want to take too much from this painting, so we were very stingy with our samples, but we're happy to nevertheless have looked. Here's a cross-section and what it looks like under the microscope. So that little sample turned onto the side and then magnified several times. And you can see the layer structure. And this is useful for when we were looking for the quartz. And so here you can see the layering structure of the painting and understand how the composition was built up. And so on the bottom, we have that brownish color that is the ground. And there's a beautiful yellow ochre particle that you can see in there as well. And then we have a gray layer over top of that, followed by a whitish layer with little bits of pigments and little bits of red for the area of the flesh tone. And on the right, you can see that same sample, but looked at with UV. And so some of the things that we can see are pigments that fluoresce in one or that disappear. For example, that yellow ochre particle does not fluoresce under the UV, and this gives us more information. We're also able to compare our cross-sections with the ones taken from Harvard in 1991 and see very similar results. This was taken in an area of black, and so the upper layer is actually a very thin black layer of paint, followed by that gray layer, which we saw in the previous sample, and again, that same brownish color along the bottom. What's interesting about this one, under the UV, you can see that fluorescing line going through, and there's actually a crack in this sample that was in the painting, and the varnish flowed through and into it, and it's fluorescing in the UV image. Okay, so we wanted to look at the ground layer and try to figure out if we could find quartz. So we looked at our cross-sections using scanning electron microscopy. This tells us very specific elemental information. And so these are the types of images that are generated, and different densities of the materials are visible. And just to go into a little bit of the science background behind it, the brighter areas indicate a higher atomic number. For example, lead pigments would appear bright white, and the absence of a strong black and white contrast indicates the presence of materials or pigments with a low atomic number, such as natural earth, including quartz, sand, and clay, and the binding medium, which would all have a low atomic number. You don't need to remember any of this. So what does all of this tell us? Well, we can look even closer and identify a specific region that we want to look at and say, well, let's identify the oxygen present in the sample and the silicon present in the sample. And here we can see the maps for those two things in the green and in the yellow. So these are areas that are rich in oxygen and silicon. And when we look at the specific chemistry of these particles, they're a good match for quartz. And we can look at all the other elements that are present as well and gain a better idea of the full composition of the overall ground layer. So I already mentioned that we did find quartz. We also found aluminosilicate clay. We found a little bit of lead, the iron, the aluminum, the potassium, the calcium. These are all consistent with what would be present in quartz ground and also in clay and also in the 17th century. And another method of analysis, just because we could, we had Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy. And we were able to use this to obtain a molecular spectrum with the use of infrared light to look for the composition of the ground. So again, we're looking for a confirmation of quartz, and we're basing this on the molecular structure and bonds, which we can then compare to a database, which is kind of like fingerprinting. We did this to look for clay or quartz as an additional method, and we were able to find kaolinite, which is a clay, quartz, as well as some peaks from lead white, which is that beautiful lead white pigment that I mentioned earlier. And just to note that this is consistent with the scanning electron microscopy results and the X-ray fluorescence results that I mentioned earlier. And what we're doing, we're looking at that is looking for specific peaks and comparing it to a known spectrum. Okay, so after all of that analysis, and there was some that I could not fit into this presentation, what were our final results? The results gave us information on the working method and the layers present on the painting, as well as the palette and specific pigments. We can also consider how artists were working in the 17th century and what was available to them at the time. On the left, we have a painting that was completed by Rembrandt of an artist in his studio at the time. So this is painted by Rembrandt, so he's painting an artist, and so we can see what he's using, including his palette hanging on the wall. On the right, we have earthenware pots that were excavated under Rembrandt's house and contain some of his materials, including quartz. In Portrait of a Young Man in an Armchair, we determined the layer structure, which consists of the canvas, which is the original canvas, the size layer that I mentioned earlier, which is that glue-based layer, a ground, which contains quartz and clay base, which is quartz and clay-based with some ochre and lead particles, a second layer that is gray, not very much composition planning, though there is that adjustment of the hands that moved from a little bit higher up to further down. Upper embellishments and impasto, which are those things that are part of the paint that stick up physically from the surface. And several layers of varnish that was applied. This would be a restoration varnish. And then to the back, we have a lead-lined canvas applied with wax, a second lining canvas applied with wax, and a new stretcher. So the painting does not have its original stretcher. And in addition to that, copious amounts of in-painting and varnish that are applied to the surface due to the number of damages that this painting had suffered. The palette found in this painting consists of bone black, umber, red and brown earth pigments, yellow earth, vermilion, a red lake, which is likely cochineal, lead white, and smalt, though there's no blue in the painting. And when we compare this to the known palette, we can see many of the same pigments present. These could have been used in any 17th century painting at the time in Holland, but all of the pigments that we were able to find did fit the list of pigments used by Rembrandt. So what does all of this tell us? I'm sure that the Memorial Art Gallery is happy to learn that our results indicate that the materials and methods that were also used by Rembrandt. However, these would have also been used by other 17th century Dutch artists. And the provenance does not extend far enough back to make the quartz findings useful at this time. You could say that we are taking these results with a grain of quartz. What the analysis and research also did was reveal the effects of the 5+ conservation campaigns that occurred in just the 20th century alone, and the previous damages that were inflicted upon the painting, and that simply by looking at the painting in its current state does not reveal the whole story. With new research and new technology, historical perspectives will continue to evolve. There is often more than meets the eye and a larger story beneath the surface. I wanted to briefly acknowledge the wonderful time this project afforded our students and our faculty, and generously thank the Memorial Art Gallery for collaborating with us. And thank you all for listening. I'm happy to answer any questions if you have them.
I'm overwhelmed with the amount of cleaning in the 20th century. Was this based on how much people smoked, or why would it require that kind of cleaning?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So why it would require that much cleaning? I mean, that is something that the profession of conservation, historically, there's been a lot of cleaning of paintings, and it has caused some controversy. A lot of the times, the varnishes that are applied to old paintings were natural resin varnishes, and these age with time, and they cross-link, and they turn yellow. And so that really impacts what we can see with the painting. A lot of the conservators that were doing that were aiming to reduce the effects of that. So it's not that it was just to do a varnish removal or just to clean it. But you do mention another point in that also people were smoking a lot. There is a lot of dirt. So that, coupled with the materials that were present on the painting, would have led to wanting the painting to be cleaned. There's a difference between cleaning the dirt off of it and also removing the varnish. So the dirt would be related perhaps to smoking or surface dirt over time. The varnish is related to the material that was used to varnish the painting. So a natural resin like damar or mastic will age over time, will become harder to remove over time, and will yellow. So areas of the painting that are lighter in color or bluish in tone, for example, won't look the same as when they were originally painted. And so that's one of the reasons why varnishes are removed.
Are you familiar with Baumgartner restorations?
I am, yes.
Totally mesmerizing to watch on YouTube. I've spent way too much time watching it.
I'm glad.
Has there been a stylistic comparison of the way in which the hands are rendered in Rembrandt's paintings? This is very interesting to me.
Yeah, I mean, the hands, they have switched in their position. That's what I can tell you from the X-ray image. That's been known for a little while, since the painting was looked at even earlier. In terms of stylistic approach, that would be something I would defer to the curators, but there has been a lot that has been published on Rembrandt's use of style, so I would be certain that that has been looked into. Yeah.
The substrates that are used here, how do they compare to other European painters, like in Spain or Italy? And is this a knowledge base that was passed around?
Do you mean the canvas support?
Yes.
The original support?
Yeah, the quartz.
Yeah, so the original support is a linen canvas with an open weave. And it would have been readily available at that time. Earlier on, paintings were done on panel, and there was a transition towards moving towards canvases. The earlier canvases tend to be coarser, more open weave, and then as technology evolves, we start to see finer linens being produced. The original canvas is in line with the 17th century type of canvases that would have been available. And earlier than that, they would have had a more open weave as well. So that's all I can really say about the canvas.
Did you find any evidence of a signature on the portrait, and are there many other Rembrandts that don't have signatures on them?
Thank you. That's a great question. We were not able to find a signature. We looked, and especially after that letter that mentioned that it had been previously signed and dated, we went back and looked. And I think, the infrared image would have been really useful, which we did. We looked, but we couldn't find evidence of the signature. It's possible that it was so heavily damaged, or it's possible that it wasn't there. I think there is, even since in 2019, when we looked at this painting, there's still other imaging that I think could be done that would be worth investigating further, including multispectral imaging. So that could be an avenue forward, but I was not able to find a signature or date. And, oh, sorry, to answer the second part of your question, yeah, there are paintings that indeed don't have signatures or dates as well. I don't know exactly how many.
As a matter of curiosity, a very common defect in paintings of this age is this the lead soap issue, which I'm sure you have heard. Did you find any evidence of lead soap or lead carboxylate formation, deterioration of the lead white? And
Yeah, so you're asking about lead soaps and whether we found them on the painting.
and have you? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Sorry, the second part?
That was all.
Oh, that's it, whether we found, okay. So we weren't specifically looking for lead soaps, but these are frequently found on all kinds of paintings and can be induced from humidity, aging, damage over time, and the migration of lead ions throughout the painting. So there's copious amounts of lead on this painting. It did appear in some of the cross sections that there would be more transparent particles that would be indicative of lead soaps, and it wouldn't be surprising for those to be there. Lead soaps form on a number of different paintings, so it wouldn't be unusual. Yeah.
But you didn't find any protrusions of those famous
We didn't find any
protrusions?
protrusions on the surface, so sometimes lead soaps manifest themselves so that they're coming up to the surface of the paint film and appear like white little bumps or protrusions, and a lot of historical paintings will show that. However, with a number of cleanings, sometimes these little protrusions will get caught on swabs and come off. So I don't recall actually seeing any on the painting. Yeah.
I'm curious about the quartz layer, the one that was under the gray layer. And,
Sorry. Yeah, I see you.
and if that, you were saying that it is unique to or not unique, you found it in other Dutch painters.
Yeah.
I'm curious if that particular ground with the quartz and the clay, is it found in Italy or France or Spain and other European countries?
So the quartz ground that is during Rembrandt's time is specific to Rembrandt, which is part of the cool thing and why we were looking at it, because it is that link. He was one of the first people to use it. He would have had access to it, and it was specifically not found on other paintings from other painters that were analyzed during that time. So that made the finding really unique, and that's been published and known for a while. But after that time period, then we start to see sources of that being used in numerous paintings. So not before. So it makes Rembrandt one of the first people or the first person to use it in his studio. But after that, it would have been more widely available, which is why it makes the quartz findings problematic, because the provenance doesn't extend far enough back to actually make them useful. Additionally, we have that quartz ground, but then there's a gray layer over top. And so in looking through the cross-sections that are published in other research, there's not a good match for that yet. So I think, a sample is only representative of one area, a little tiny area of the painting, and from that we infer that it's present everywhere. So I do think that could be further analyzed as well. But in terms of the quartz ground itself, it is a link to Rembrandt, though unfortunately afterwards other people caught on and were using it as well. Yep.
What sort of new techniques or technologies do you see on the horizon that could help with attributing paintings to a particular artist?
I mean, it's so problematic because if you don't have records going back, it makes it very difficult. So you could have all of the materials that are present and that would have been used by a certain artist. And then if you're lacking in records, there's that critical element of, well, who owned it? Where is that really ties it back, especially if there is no signature or no date. However, there are things like brushstroke analysis, analysis of the canvases themselves. So I know with Vermeer's, there's been paintings that they've found that the fabric, the linen came from the same bolt of fabric. And so there is roots for additional analysis, including imaging, including additional scientific analysis. And I think we'll see more of those come to the surface going forward. Yeah.
So any chance AI will be used?
I think that is a great, I think there is a huge potential for AI in this field, absolutely. I don't know what form it will be at or how people will trust the results based on some of the questions AI has been asked recently, but I do think that that's going to be invaluable going forward, yes. Okay. Well, thank you very much.